Hello everyone, Cole Anderson here, the independent pianist. I wanted to talk today about a topic that I touched on in a previous video. There was some interest in hearing me say a little bit more about it. I did a video in which I talked about the things that I hated about music schools, so I put a link to that in the description box if you missed it. I'm also planning to make a video of the things that I love about music schools, just to be fair, but anyway. Also, I should say, if you want to skip straight to my tips about how to improve your memory, you can do that using the timestamps in the description box below. I'm going to indulge in a bit of a setup here about why we memorize and why we perhaps don't always need to play without the score in performance. Also, sorry this video is a little bit late coming out today. It's still Friday where I am, maybe not where all of you are, but I just had a concert today, kind of a big concert that I had to prepare for, so I'm just getting to finishing up this video now. It's about 9 p.m. where I am at the moment. Anyway, in that last video, I spoke a bit about my dissatisfaction that I have felt in the past with the kind of ludicrous artificial standards of memory that are required of pianists in music schools and in the professional world too, competitions in particular. Although that is starting to change now, and it becomes more and more common to see great artists using the score in solo performance. So just in the last month, I've run across videos online of performers like Paul Lewis, Ingrid Fleether, Christian Zacharias, Angela Hewitt, Richard Good, and even Yuzhao Wang, all using the score in solo performances of some sort. And of course, that doesn't even take into account kind of trend-setting figures in this regard, like Sviatoslav Richter and Gilbert Kalish, who went against the norm by using the score exclusively in performance when it wasn't looked on with favor. And I know that at least Richter underwent some pretty harsh criticism from certain quarters for his decision to do that. I, of course, find this all to be very encouraging. I think it's a sign, along with the growing number of artists who actually feel comfortable talking to their audience during a concert, that we are moving towards a much more informal, personal, and meaningful, ultimately meaningful kind of relationship with music that is not dependent on artificial standards that are kind of inhuman. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that memorization is a great skill to develop, and I think that we should always memorize the music that we play. In fact, I feel that in the course of correctly studying a piece in the way it, quote-unquote, should be studied, we will inevitably end up with the work in our memory. There's just no way around it if you're really working on it with the kind of dedication that a great piece of music deserves. As an example of what I mean, just take some kind of great string quartet, performing a Beethoven quartet or whatever. They're playing with the music in front of them, generally speaking, but in truth, they're usually barely looking at the music. The music is just there to ensure that the ensemble doesn't fall apart because someone has a slip, or something like that. But they don't actually need the music in the deepest sense. And the same happens for me particularly when I'm playing works that I know very well and that I'm very emotionally invested in playing. I use the music mostly for brief visual cues to keep me focused, but in a work that I know well, I'm hardly glued to the page. I mainly just focused on overall musical shapes and guideposts, not individual notes. Having the score there just helps me to maintain calm and a connection to the music itself. Of course, the number one problem that I see with not requiring memorization is with some students, because many students don't necessarily know what kind of dedication needs to be lavished on a piece of music before we really own it in every fiber of our being. It's worth remembering that we humans are by nature rather given to finding shortcuts and avoiding difficulties, which is all very good from a certain point of view, but it can also get us into trouble, and in the area of music is a very good example of that. I think it's absolutely true that if not required to memorize, many students will endeavor to get by with as little concentrated work as possible. They won't dedicate themselves to knowing and analyzing every little detail about the music. They'll just play it until it's good enough. So until a student has really learned to enjoy and actually seeks of their own accord to interact with a score like this, I do require them to consciously memorize, for there's no better way to induce them to learn in a more conscious and analytical way. So from this perspective, memory is very important. Of course, we don't want to be slaves to the printed music. We want to be able to play our music whenever we want to, without having to find a score. And at the same time, I think we go too far, though, when we require a concertizing pianist, for example, to play every single note of every single piece that they play without a score in front of them. It not only places far too much nervous strain on the artist, depending on the individual, I think it can oftentimes ruin interpretations because of the extra nervous tension involved, but it also forces the artist to limit their repertoire in an extreme way, and I think that's really kind of a shame. The people who really miss out are the audience members, after all. To give you an idea of how this works, in reality, many concert artists will tour with only one or maybe two full concert programs, which they will usually vary a little bit here and there, but generally for a whole season they'll play just one or two programs, and to this they may add, a dozen concerti or something like that. Concerti tend to be a little easier on the memory since you're not playing everything, and they have to limit themselves like this just because maintaining and keeping more music than that at proof positive performance level, free from any possibility of error, would just be too much strain. This setup is fine for some people, of course, but I always think of Artur Schnabel saying, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something like, "I'm incapable of being like an actor who can be content playing Hamlet every night for a year." He just didn't understand how you could do that. Schnabel was someone who still went along with the whole memorizing thing because it was expected in his day, and he got himself into some tricky spots in performances as a result of his large repertoire. He just needed to have that kind of variety and stimulation. Of course, he had such a strong level of self-confidence and comfort with himself that it didn't even seem to bother him when things happened in performance. So there's a famous story that he was playing the A major Mozart concerto in a concert toward the end of his life. I think it's actually, the recording is available. You can hear it, I think, on YouTube. At any rate, though, he, in the last movement, went one direction, the orchestra went another, they just came apart, and they couldn't get back on. They just had to stop. And most performers, of course, would have been absolutely devastated by this happening, but for Schnabel, it was no problem. He just kind of grinned, went up to the conductor, they found a spot to start, and they played beautifully after that. So it's a great story, and I really admire Schnabel's kind of fortitude and self-confidence here. But I can't help but feeling that it might have been better just for the music itself if he had just had the score in front of him. However, for generations, people who have had any kind of psychological issues with memorization have had to face very moralistic attitudes from the establishment. That stands true up to the present day. One of my teachers, for example, was talking to me after a concert given by Richard Good, and at this concert, Richard Good had played several Bach fugues, which he used the score for, and this teacher had been at a reception with Mr. Good, and he had heard him talking about all the books he had been reading lately and so forth. He'd been talking about some things like that, and this teacher said to me, I'll never forget, he said, "I just thought he should have read fewer books and memorized his Bach fugues." This teacher, by the way, is a marvelous performer, but one much given to memory slips, ironically, sometimes catastrophic ones, as these things go in performance. He chooses to put himself through that stress because he considers it to be much more inspiring to play by memory, which I can totally understand. That's a very valid point for some people. You are certainly sacrificing a kind of nervous energy if you use the score, at least until you get used to it. But I often thought later how remarkably judgmental and close-minded it was of him to insist that someone else should be doing the same thing that he's doing. Not everyone wants to necessarily torture themselves in that way. Sometimes they're willing to sacrifice that kind of extra frisson that you get from playing by memory. And I certainly respect Richard Good for going with what was right for him, and by extension what was best for the music he was playing. Anyway, I wouldn't blame that teacher for having that attitude anyway. I mean, it's all too common among academia and in the professional world as well, and it's just what he got used to during his youth and his professional training. There are many arguments that we hear about why it's good for us to perform without the score for an audience. You'll oftentimes hear that it's more respectful to do so. I understand where that comes from too. Supposedly, if you are playing totally from memory, that shows that you have really fully learned the music and that you spent a good deal of time preparing it to be able to do that. But really, it could just as easily go the other way. In the early days of playing in public by memory back in the 19th century, artists like Clara Schumann and Franz Liszt were oftentimes attacked in the press for their arrogance in playing a piece of music by memory, as if they were trying to pretend that they were improvising it on the spot. And this is actually very interesting because the practice of playing repertoire by memory went hand in hand with the gradual decline of improvisation as a major feature on concert programs. And that's really a great shame. And I think that we should, at least to some degree, try to follow the lead of figures like Frederick Rzewski and Gabriela Montero in bringing improvisation back to the classical sphere. It should be something that every classical musician learns to do alongside their Beethoven sonatas and Bach fugues or what have you. Although it was Clara Schumann who really started the practice of playing entire recitals from memory, I mean, undoubtedly she wanted to avoid page turners and other inconveniences related to having the score there, she did in her old age return to using the music in performance. And Liszt, who was also so famous for playing by memory, in reality he only ever played about half of his actually rather small performing repertoire by memory. In fact, after retiring from the concert stage, he would frequently use the music in impromptu performances. For example, famously, he loved to play his B minor sonata for guests who visited him in Weimar, and right around the time that he composed it. It was a favorite of his, but he would always have the score in front of him. Now, this might have been an affectation. He might have wanted to impress the highly structured nature of the music on his listeners, but it is also suggestive that he cautioned his students not to put excessive strain on their memories. And that was the approach that I found with one of my teachers, Mark Salmon, who was a fabulous pianist based in the Seattle area. He was one of my teachers during my teens, and he was a great performer, just mind-boggling performer, and he would mix playing by memory with using the score in his concerts. And that's something that I'd never seen before. And he would just do it depending on what was comfortable for him at the moment. And I think that's probably a much more reasonable approach to take, rather than always having to do every single piece without the music. He was able to do some very daring and interesting projects because of that, because he wasn't chained to the idea that he had to play everything by memory. There are famous examples, too, of performers who seem to just have given much more focused and disciplined, rich performances when they used the score as opposed to playing without it. And a famous example is someone I just mentioned, Sviatoslav Richter. Richter played by memory for the bulk of his career, and then abruptly he started using the score for everything that he played. And he said that this was partly due to his hearing going out of tune. It would unpredictably sound like he was playing in the wrong key, and he would get confused and lose his place. I'm sure memory strain also played a role there, but I'm always struck by how much more measured and balanced his playing was after he started using the score. I never really liked his almost bizarrely impulsive approach that he had in his earlier recordings. He always seemed to be rushing ahead and kind of on edge. And it seemed like he really found his artistic grounding and balance when he just had the score there in front of him. Another artist who's personally known to me that I heard doing both a memorized solo performance and a performance with the score was Svetozar Ivanov. And Svetozar is currently active as a pianist. He's an incredibly imaginative and powerful artist. He usually does some kind of a very interesting multimedia presentation along with his music. I've seen him do things with dance, things related to poetry, and all kinds of things. And I noticed that there was a palpable increase in his confidence and clarity of intention when he simply used the music. That slight bit of fear or underlying anxiety was gone, and all that was left was magnificent music making. I don't think it was because he wasn't able to memorize. After all, I saw him play by memory perfectly fine. He just removed a little bit of anxiety, and it just made the music flow so much more pleasingly. So these examples and many more like them have served to kind of make me stop and think about what we do and why we do it. Why do we really memorize like this? Why do we require that we not have the score in front of us in a concert? And I was forced to the conclusion that, at least in my own case, it really had much more to do with pride. We do this just so that it can palpably appear that we know the work in every detail. We do it because we don't want to be the person who uses the score when other people are playing by memory. We don't want to feel inferior in that way. But I think maybe it would be better to forget our pride and feel free to do what is right for us as individuals without any shame. So now, having argued exhaustively about why we shouldn't feel compelled to play without the music on stage if we don't want to, now let me go about discussing some strategies for making your memory stronger and more retentive. After years and years of experience playing by memory and memorizing, sometimes very quickly, I have come to this conclusion. The number one factor in having a strong memory is time. So, a story related to this. I was at a talk given by famed pianist Murray Pariah, and in the Q&A afterwards, there was a student who asked him, how do you memorize and learn more music faster? And obviously this student was looking for some kind of top secret trick of the trade from Pariah, who famously has an enormous repertoire that he plays by memory. He wasn't expecting the answer which he got, which was, actually, I never consciously try to memorize anything. I just learn the music extremely well and thoroughly, and in the end, it is memorized. And I could tell that that student was bitterly disappointed, but really, all the tips or tricks that I'm going to tell you are just ways to know the music better. And that's really the only secret, knowing the music as well as you possibly can for as long as you possibly can. And then you reach a point where you really know the music, and when you really know it, you're not going to forget it. That brings us to the big dichotomy when it comes to memory problems and to people who think that they have bad memories. All memory problems fall into two categories. Category number one, the performer doesn't know the piece well enough. At a high level, this is actually very rare. Category number two is by far the more common. The performer does know the piece well enough, but they are psyching themselves out in some way, or they simply have not known the piece long enough and played it in enough stressful situations to really feel secure playing by memory. How do people psych themselves out? Well, there's many ways, but the most common way is by overworking their memory in an effort to reduce the chance of slips. And I remember doing this myself many times, trying to repeat pieces many times the day before a concert, for example, in order to make sure that I remembered them and that I wasn't going to forget. This becomes even more of a problem because people will attribute problems that are really from the second category to the first category. They'll think that they don't know the music well enough, and so they'll obsess about it even more and try to use pure repetition to remove the chance of having slips, and that will actually just induce more slips and less confidence, and it's a nasty, vicious kind of cycle, and I've been in it myself many times, so I know what I'm talking about. At a certain point, I discovered by accident almost that when I had less time to prepare, I usually had fewer memory slips. And it didn't really matter how hard I tried to secure my memory. The things that I simply knew better and that I had learned longer ago, that I'd played more often in concert, I just played better in those pieces. I had fewer memory slips or none at all. It was that simple. You have to remember that when we play for people, especially when we don't know them or know what to expect of their reaction, we become hyper aware of every little detail about what we're doing. And this is, ironically, exactly what we need to have a super strong memory. So we need to try to induce that more in our practicing if we want to really have a strong memory from the beginning. This is exactly why students, by the way, have a hard time getting really confident with their memory, because they'll usually be building up for one huge event where they have to play by memory in a really stressful situation. And up to then, they're only playing for themselves, maybe for their teacher, people that they trust. If they had to play the same pieces in 10 recitals by memory, spaced out over the course of a year, for example, they would feel pretty secure by the end. Just imagine how it is for concert artists who play 150 concerts a year, usually with most of the same repertoire. That builds confidence, and it feeds on itself, but it's hard to reach that level, of course. I found that I could minimize serious memory slips by not obsessing over my memory in non-technically difficult passages right before a concert. That's really where we tend to obsess and have the most problems. It's in passages that are not technically so difficult, but which might be kind of intricate in other ways and not so obvious from a theoretical standpoint. So instead of trying to repeat those passages over and over again to remember them, I would just make sure that my foundation was good, that I had studied them from every standpoint, theoretically speaking, and that I really understood what was going on compositionally in all possible facets. Being aware of this problem is half the battle, because most people aren't even aware that this is something that can happen. They just think that their memory's not good. But it's not that your memory is not good, it's just that you are being forced to obsess too much over this issue. Of course, trying to play for people more often and record more often, that's all very helpful. Imagining that you're in the situation of playing for a big audience is very helpful. But still, this is something that can affect anyone, so you really just have to be aware of it and be careful when it comes, and try to avoid this pitfall. Avoid overwork on memory passages. Now, as for the first category, though, how to know a piece better. It's a little bit out of the scope of this video to tell you everything you would need to know here, but I can definitely get you started. So theoretical knowledge is a must. However, it needs to be theoretical knowledge that you put into practice in the music. You need to start training yourself to see patterns in all your pieces. Larger structural patterns, of course, like the overall form, but also smaller harmonic and melodic patterns as well. So first of all, you should definitely know all of your major and minor scales and all of the common chords, triads, and seventh chords, like the back of your hand. You should know them in all their inversions. You should know all the possible fingerings for them as well, instinctively, so that your hand will go to those fingerings automatically. And you should practice finding them in the music itself as well. There are endless ways in which these simple materials are composed out in real compositions. So that is really the trick. You have to try to see things in perspective. Never memorize by individual notes. Instead, see patterns, phrases, groups of notes. Then also learn Roman numeral analysis and learn some of the more important progressions of harmonies that occur again and again in tonal music. Cadences, sequences, things like the descending fifth sequence, and so forth. So I'll give you a couple of examples so that you can kind of see how this works in practice. And these will just be some things that I uploaded recently on my channel. So take the opening of Mozart's Sonata Koelschel 545. The experienced musician who knows their keyboard theory will immediately be able to identify the tonic, dominant, and subdominant chord that are outlined in the left hand, and the way that the right hand melody traces these harmonies. The next scalar passage is very simple, actually, when you realize that there's a repeating pattern in the right hand that is moving down by step, and that the fingering is also going to repeat in each measure. Again, the chords in the left hand form a very typical series of harmonies supporting this sequence. This is a relatively simple example, and I'm sure for many of you out there, you'd be saying to yourself, well, this is not that hard to memorize. But it's precisely this kind of advanced pattern finding that allows experienced musicians to read incredibly quickly and memorize practically at first sight when you apply it to more and more complex things. You can immediately grasp the music in all its larger features, and you don't have to mess around with reading or memorizing note by note, as many students, even at a college level, unfortunately do. So what we're really doing here in our mind is simplifying. We're moving backwards along the path that the composer took in writing the piece. We're divining the basic scaffolding that the composer used to hang his or her free composition on. And that gives us the key to remembering and interpreting as well. So for the advanced pianists out there, I'll give you one very difficult passage, one from near the end of Rachmaninoff's B-flat major prelude, and I'll show you how we would go about organizing this in our mind to memorize it. So in this passage, we see a welter of complicated looking chords seemingly thrown at random at the page. But is it random? So if you look carefully, you'll see that there are 8 appearances of the B-flat major triad in various spacings and inversions. And 5 of these occurrences are on or near important beats. These act as our first structural goalposts in the passage. Instinctively, I am aiming for these chords as I play this passage in performance. Well, then we just need to know what happens in between these chords. Well, the first 4 chords are 2 G minor chords interspersed with diminished chords. And diminished 7th chords, half diminished 7th chords, and diminished triads you run into all the time as transition chords connecting 2 harmonies, because they're very unstable. So the G minor chord is also scale degree 6 in B-flat major, so we have that reference as well. In between chords 1 and 2, we have another diminished triad leading to G minor again, and then to C minor. And this is a descending 5th pattern, by the way, which you see all the time from G to C. And C is scale degree 2 in B-flat major. So we're still within diatonic harmonies at this point. Then if we look at the chords in between chords 2 and 3, we have, again, another inversion of B-flat major, and then G minor again, and another diminished chord leading to the next B-flat major chord. Then in between chords 3 and 4, we have something a little bit more complicated. We have a half diminished 7th chord leading to A major. A major here is acting as the dominant of the next chord, D minor, which is the 3 chord in B-flat major. So again, this is kind of a descending 5th thing going on, a dominant to tonic, a little tonicization of D minor. And then next we get B-flat major and E-flat major. So E-flat major is the 4 chord. So it is again all kind of diatonic chords going back to B-flat major. In between chords 4 and 5, we get much the same kind of thing going on. There's a diminished chord, a G minor chord, B-flat chord, E-flat chord, another diminished chord. So again, it's all kind of diatonic harmonies. And then this last kind of tricky little bit at the end is a straight descending 5th sequence. So it's actually pretty logical and straightforward. The bass is falling by 5ths, and because it has to go up and down, it's falling by 5ths and rising by 4ths, but the bass motion is a 5th descending. A to D to G to C to F to B. And the harmonies, likewise, are descending by 5ths. A dominant 7th chord to D dominant 7th chord to G dominant 7th chord to C minor 7th to F dominant 7th to B diminished 7th. And then at the end here, we have a little cadential progression. So that's 2 inversions of the C minor chord, the 2 chord in B-flat major. There's an applied dominant, what's called an applied dominant, the C dominant 7th chord at the end of that top line, which is the 5 of the 5 chord, the F dominant 7th chord, which is part of the cadence at the start of the second line. So you can kind of see that if you parse even a very complicated passage like this into its structural elements, you can start to see groups of notes, groups of chords. And that's really how you have to think in order to play this passage smoothly and in order to memorize it well. So I really can't emphasize this enough. If you want to have a really great memory, it's not enough just to play through your pieces mechanically. You need to really look deeply at them and understand what is going on in the music. If you do that, you'll be able to know them and you'll be able to remember them. In addition to this, don't expect it to happen overnight. You do need to let these things sit and be with you for a long time before you're really going to feel comfortable doing these things under pressure. After all, any activity, even a simple one, is going to feel weird if you're doing it when a bunch of people are staring at you. Just imagine if you were doing the dishes for an audience of 5,000 at Carnegie Hall or something like that. You would feel pretty weird and self-conscious. And now when you consider doing a really complicated task like playing the piano, you can understand why people have problems doing that and how much training and time is really required to feel comfortable with it. So I hope this may have convinced you that you do not, in fact, have a bad memory. I think it's very rare to have an actual bad memory. Usually just people don't know how to use their memories or put themselves to the test too often or too soon. So thank you for watching this video. Please do consider supporting the channel financially if you can. You can do that through patreon.com, www.patreon.com/independentpianist, or I have a PayPal link in the description box. Any donation that you make, however small, will help me to continue bringing you this content. So please do consider doing that. But besides that, you can also like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. All that really helps me as well. So until next time, this is Cole Anderson signing off.